When people raise the idea of great men of history, two men always make the list: Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte. And this is for very good reason. It is 1804. Europe has undergone one of its greatest upheavals in all of history. Colonies of the great European empires are beginning to be lost, and the British king is deteriorating worse and worse. Yet in Notre Dame Cathedral, a new emperor will be crowned with the crown of Charlemagne, or at least a replica of it. Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most towering figures of all human history. But how did he get to this point? The Emperor Napoleon was born Napoleon de Bonaparte in August of 1769 in the newly French-controlled Corsica. The son of Carlo de Bonaparte, he was descended from minor Tuscan nobility. Though not being particularly wealthy, his father was friends with the Corsican governor, through whom he was able to secure connections to the court of the French King Louis XVI. This allowed the young Napoleon to attend military school in the French mainland. He didn't fit in very well. His awkward mannerisms and Corsican accent earned him mockery from his fellow students, though he did show a great aptitude for learning, spending much of his time reading. In 1784, he was admitted to l'École Militaire to train to become an artillery officer, and upon the death of his father, his family's finances worsened, requiring him to finish school in a year. Thus, in September of 1785, he graduates and commissions, beginning his military career. He begins his career in Valence and Auxonne, yet the events of the French Revolution cause him to return to Corsica, where he joins and fights with the pro-French Jacobins, an action which would ultimately require him to flee to the French mainland. There he returns to his old regiment and is made a captain, showing excellent command ability as an artillery officer in the siege of Toulon. This acumen for leadership earns him the attention of Augustin Robespierre, the younger brother of France's Jacobin leader, Maximilien Robespierre. In 1793, earning the confidence of the rebel government, he is given the rank of brigadier general. Keep in mind that he only graduated military school 8 years prior, and that he is only 24 years old. And by February of the next year, he is placed in command of the Army of Italy, directed to plan an attack on Sardinia, a campaign which is ultimately successful. Yet, by July, the government of Maximilien Robespierre fell, and on the 28th of July, Maximilien Robespierre is executed. This causes the Revolutionary Republic to fall under a new government, a transitional government known as the Thermidorian Reaction, as this government would come to power in the month of Thermidor. What is Thermidor? Well, in an effort to wipe out all vestiges of the old France, the revolutionaries changed the entire calendar, making this period of French history absolutely absurd. The new government, wishing to remove any vestiges of Robespierre's government, become quite suspicious of Napoleon. He is arrested, yet released 2 weeks later, before inviting him right back into military command. He plans multiple successful campaigns in 1795, and is an excellent leader. Yet, in September of that year, he refuses to join a military campaign in Vendée, and is thus taken off of the list of generals in regular service. But only 1 month later, his military genius is needed once more, as he is called in to defend the government from rebels which he successfully defeats. He is later made commander of the Army of the Interior and head of the Army of Italy. Around this time in March of 1796, he marries Joséphine de Beauharnais, the former wife of the deceased Alexandre de Beauharnais, who was executed at the hands of Jacobins. She came from a noble family who had lost much of their wealth, while her deceased husband had been the Viscount of Beauharnais, and had had a military career, including in the American Revolution. Yet, only 2 days after his wedding, Napoleon leaves for a military campaign in Italy, where he racks up enormous successes, earning him great fame and influence back in France. He is able to successfully penetrate deep into Habsburg territory. He even begins to plan an attack on Britain, yet determines that the navy was insufficient to go up against the British Royal Navy, and instead plans to capture land in Egypt, cutting Britain off from their vital trade in India. On July 1st of 1799, he lands in Alexandria, Egypt. There he initially experiences mostly victories fighting with the Mamluks. Yet over time, as he makes further incursions into Ottoman lands, combat fatalities and disease begin to wear on his numbers. To make matters worse, the British Navy under the command of Lord Admiral Horatio Nelson had destroyed all but 2 of Napoleon's ships, making evacuation impossible. Yet he learns of a series of French defeats back in Europe and decides to return to France. He leaves his troops saying that he will return for them, but he does not. He returns to find a bankrupt and disorderly France, whose disorganized government, the Directory, experiences a low perception of legitimacy and next to no support. Allying with senior leaders of France's government, he plans to overthrow the Directory. He brings troops into the halls of government, and acquiescing, the government reforms its structure, where he will ultimately be made first consul, a position which would give him near dictatorial power, and one which he will be given for life. Now with near total power secured, he turns his attention to stabilizing the disordered nation. In the following years, France begins to stabilize, and its economy improves. His power is consolidated, France is improving, and everything seems to be looking up for Napoleon. Yet, in 1804, he discovers an assassination plot against him. He sees a disorderly France. He sees that same corrupt entity of politicians, financiers, and bureaucrats. This is very similar to what was seen with Oliver Cromwell. He began as a revolutionary, but as he came to see the true mechanisms of power that had emerged, he realizes that the French people need a true leader, a true prince to fend off that entity, that same corrupt, all-consuming thing. To quote Napoleon, "I found the crown in the gutter. I picked it up, and the people put it on my head." And thus, supported by a vote of the plebiscite, Napoleon is crowned Emperor of France. The France that Napoleon had inherited was a chaotic mess. The Directory government had been set up in the Constitution of 1795, and during its run existed in a constant state of war with Britain, Austria, Prussia, Naples, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. Some politically minded revolutionaries had used the revolutionary fervor in order to advance their aims, yet they found out, as so tragically often happens, that such fervor cannot be contained. The period known as the Reign of Terror would commence under the leadership of Maximilian Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. Yet, in the ironic fate that blind zeal often begets, the terror would swallow its own, and Maximilian Robespierre would be executed. The Directory wished to avoid this sort of spiraling, hoping to begin rebuilding France to some semblance of a stable society. They constructed a bicameral legislature, with the indirect voting for deputies. Voting would have property qualifications, and the legislature would be made up of two houses, the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients, one to draft legislation and one to approve it. Yet, the Directory proved incapable and could not reorganize the fractious society. In its constant state of war, the revolutionary French Republic had taken on enormous debts and had become entirely dependent on the financing from the banking class of Europe. Ultimately, revolutionary France's currency would collapse from hyperinflation after losing more than 99% of its initial value. There was heavy speculation on France's currency, and some financiers became extraordinarily wealthy betting on the failing currency. And the cash-strapped, heavily indebted Directory became all too open to corruption, creating overly favorable deals with prominent financiers. This the Directory had in common with the Committee of Public Safety. While the Committee of Public Safety had banned all joint stock companies and seized the assets of the French India Company, directors of the company had bribed senior politicians, leading to the execution of the officials involved. Now, under the Directory, the relationship between the financial class and the government could be seen as mutual necessity. Though there still remained a public sentiment of distrust toward the financial class, the Directory proved all too willing to engage in corruption, and the financiers all too willing to exploit the Directory. When Napoleon rose to power as first consul, he set about making major changes to the French economy and financial system, creating La Banque de France, which he modeled on the Bank of England. He would also organize and regulate the financial system. Yet Napoleon's France existed at war constantly as well, and thus he was highly dependent on the financing of the banking class. Just as they had achieved great prominence in the Dutch and British empires, the French Empire would become enormously dependent on financiers as well. Napoleon would consolidate revolutionary debt and reissue it as perpetual bonds. All the while, major banking families became a necessity for Napoleon's France. Figures like Gabriel Julien Ouvrard, Jean-Frédéric Perregaux, and the network of Jacques Necker. Another force which would become quite prominent as Napoleon's wars picked up would be the Rothschild family, which we will call the Rothschild family in England. Like in England, Napoleon would give the Bank of France a monopoly on the issuance of currency. The bank would be made up of its member banks, being the major merchant banks of France. Ouvrard would serve as regent of the bank. And while his dependence grew, Napoleon's relationship with the financial class wasn't always cozy. He was careful not to let them amass too much power. and would even jail a ward. There's a difficult, tense history between revolutionaries and the financial class. The financial class had been major financiers and patrons of liberal ideas, and there was widespread support for liberalism across Europe's financial elite, with many of the salons where philosophers, ideologues, academics, and radicals alike would meet to discuss ideas, being financed by members of this class. On the one hand, liberalism was perfect for their class. It encouraged trade policies that would work advantageously for them, discouraged the sort of social bonds that would keep people taking care of each other and not beholden to the financiers. It would weaken the legitimacy of the nobility and monarchy, providing them an avenue to gain more power. And that's not to say that there's some grand, sinister plan, but people very often have a way of finding a way for their ideals to match with what's in their own interests. Perhaps it was conscious, trying to seed the minds of the people and the youth to create their preferred social order, or perhaps it was unconscious, simply gravitating toward the ideas that worked best for them. Maybe it's just honestly what they came to believe, or maybe a bit of each. Either way, this class had been financing, fueling, backing, and benefiting from the rise of this new social order. Yet radicals like the Jacobins viewed them with enormous distrust and hatred. They saw them as a self-interested vestige of the old regime, and oppressive. Perhaps that's still the dynamic playing out today. The wealthy financial class as strong proponents of liberalism and the liberal world order, while the radicals, who take liberal ideas to their ultimate conclusions, see them as enemies. It's always the wealthiest and most powerful who speak about equality and the liberal order, and that order has been very nice to them. Well, this dynamic was certainly felt in Napoleon's France. And just as Napoleon was a dynamic tension between the ideals of revolutionary France and the tradition of monarchy, so too was there great uncertainty about how France felt toward these bankers. One thing was for certain: war is expensive. By 1805, Napoleon would find himself facing a coalition of Europe's most powerful nations. France, aided by Spain, Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden, would find itself at war against Austria, the United Kingdom, Russia, Naples, Sicily, and Sweden, in the War of the Third Coalition. By this point, Napoleon as general and as first consul had already been steamrolling through Europe. And if there's one thing that the continental powers like to do, it's maintain a really precise balance of power. And France, it was deemed, had become far too large. It was a big blue blob. And Napoleon once again showed his military genius and won the war. In 1806, the coalition would come back to fight Napoleon again, and he would win again. And 1809, the War of the Fifth Coalition. Napoleon wins once again. By this point, either directly or indirectly, Napoleon ruled about 40% of the entire European population. In 1811, after a series of growing tensions and disputes, Napoleon attempts to invade Russia, resulting in enormous losses, yet ultimately Napoleon is repelled and returns to France. In 1812, while being pushed back by Russian forces through Eastern Europe, the coalition decided to come back together for the War of the Sixth Coalition, which would ultimately defeat Napoleon. And when deciding on terms for a peace, it was decided that Napoleon would abdicate his throne. Thus, with the signing of the Treaty of Fontainebleau in April of 1814, Napoleon leaves France to live in exile in Elba. This is the end of the great historic figure. All good stories must come to an end. And so did the story of Napoleon's exile. And he just came right back to France. March of 1815, only a couple months later, he goes right back to France. Troops are sent to stop him, but he walks right up to them, and they immediately join him. He goes into France, and the new king, Louis XVIII, simply decides to leave. So Napoleon just walked right back into being emperor. Well, this entirely horrifies the coalition, and so they amass troops once more to try to force Napoleon back out. He prepares troops of his own and goes to meet the British commander, Field Marshal Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. The two great men faced each other in battle, each with conviction, patriotism, and military genius. Yet ultimately, l'Empereur was defeated and lived the rest of his life in exile.